The room smelled like money and machine oil, and those two things had no business being in the same place. That was the first thing Garrett Finch noticed when he wheeled his cart through the service entrance of the Dallas Convention Center on a Tuesday morning in March. The kind of morning where the sky couldn't decide if it wanted to be gray or blue, and the air outside still bit cold enough to make your eyes water. He'd driven 4 hours from Odessa, alone. His daughter had wanted to come, but he'd told her no, and he'd felt guilty about it the whole drive down. The cart was a flatbed he'd borrowed from the loading dock behind his shop. On it sat something wrapped in moving blankets and bungee cords, something that looked, to anyone glancing over, like a piece of junk he'd hauled off a ranch road. In a way, that wasn't entirely wrong. Some of the steel had come from a decommissioned pump jack. Some of the seals he'd machined himself from stock he ordered online. Late at night, after his daughter Becca was asleep. He'd been working on it for 3 years. He didn't tell people that. 3 years sounded like too long and not long enough at the same time, depending on who was asking. Garrett was 51 years old and had worked with engines his whole life. Not in any glamorous way. He hadn't gone to MIT. He hadn't worked for NASA or Boeing or any of the defense contractors that had offices down in Houston. He'd grown up in Crane County, the son of a man who fixed farm equipment for a living, and he'd learned to read a torque spec before he could read a map. After high school, he'd done 2 years at a community college, then spent the next decade and a half working in oil field equipment maintenance. Long stretches away from home, hot summers, cold winters, the kind of work that makes your hands look 20 years older than your face. He'd been married once. Her name was Donna. She died of a pulmonary embolism 11 days after their daughter was born. Becca was now 9 years old, and the only reason Garrett Finch got out of bed in the morning, which sounds like a cliché until you've actually been the person lying there in the dark at 4 a.m. trying to find a reason. He hadn't planned on inventing anything. That wasn't how he thought of himself. What happened was simpler and stranger than that. In 2019, working on a compressor unit out at a natural gas processing facility, he noticed something. A recurring inefficiency in how the valve timing was managed under variable load conditions, something the engineers who designed the unit hadn't accounted for, or hadn't cared about, or had known about and ignored for cost reasons. He started thinking about it on the drive home. He was still thinking about it 3 weeks later. He bought a notebook. He started sketching. He told himself it was just something to do with his hands after Becca went to sleep. But it grew. The sketches became calculations. The calculations became a design. The design became parts lists ordered one piece at a time, paid for slowly from a savings account that wasn't meant for this. He converted half his detached garage into a workspace. He worked most nights from 9 until midnight, sometimes later. He made mistakes. He threw things away and started over. He burned his forearm on a grinding wheel in November of 2021, and the scar was still there, pink and slightly raised on the inside of his left arm. What he was building was a modified valve actuation system for natural gas compressors, something that could increase efficiency under the exact variable load conditions he'd observed, by 15 to 20%, depending on operating parameters. He didn't have a patent attorney. He didn't have investors. He had a notebook, a garage, and the particular kind of stubbornness that grows in people who have already survived the worst thing they thought could happen to them. By the fall of 2022, he had a working prototype. He didn't tell anyone, not right away. The Extra Mile Energy Innovation Expo was held every 2 years at the Dallas Convention Center and was, by most accounts in the oil and gas industry, the most important gathering of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. It drew engineers, executives, venture capital firms, procurement officers from national energy companies, and a rotating cast of academics and policy people who wrote papers about the future of fossil fuel infrastructure and argued about those papers at cocktail hours. Entry for exhibitors was competitive. Companies paid tens of thousands of dollars for booth space. The keynote speakers had names you would recognize if you worked in the industry, and some you would recognize even if you didn't. Garrett had submitted his application 11 months earlier, on the last possible day before the deadline, sitting at his kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, Becca's drawings held to the refrigerator with magnets at the edge of his vision. He'd attached his technical specifications, his performance data from the prototype test he'd run in the garage, and later in a borrowed equipment yard outside of Midland, and a photograph of the unit itself. He'd been accepted 4 months later. He hadn't told anyone about that either, not at first. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because saying it out loud would make it real, and real things could fail. He told Becca eventually. She'd made him a card with a drawing of a rocket ship on it. He kept it in the glove compartment of his truck. The registration desk was staffed by a young woman in a blazer who looked at his cart, then at his badge, then back at the cart, and said nothing but had a way of pressing her lips together that communicated a great deal. He was assigned to a booth at the far end of Hall C, which was the exhibitor equivalent of being seated at the table near the kitchen. The booths around him were for small regional suppliers and one company that made software for pipeline inspection reports. He set up the unit on the folding table the convention center provided. He had a laptop with a presentation he'd built himself, and a printed technical summary in a binder, and a handwritten index card with the web address for the testing documentation he'd uploaded to a file-sharing site. The booth next to his for a hydraulic seal manufacturer out of Tulsa had a backlit display and 2 employees in matching polo shirts. Garrett stood there in his cleanest flannel shirt and looked at what he'd put together and tried not to think too hard about it. The expo floor opened at 9. By 10:30 he'd spoken with 7 people. 4 of them had glanced at the unit, said interesting, and moved on. One had asked if he was with a company, and when he said no, the man had nodded slowly in the way people nod when they're deciding to stop listening. One woman, a procurement coordinator from a mid-sized operator out of Corpus Christi, had actually sat down and gone through the binder, asking careful questions. She'd taken his card. One person had laughed, not a laugh exactly. More of a sound, a short exhale through the nose, a half-smile, made by a man in a gray suit who'd stopped at the edge of the booth, looked at the unit, and said without breaking stride, "What is this, a garage project?" The way he said garage project, it carried a meaning that had nothing to do with garages. Garrett said yes, actually, it was. The man kept walking. She came at 11:45, 10 minutes before the lunch break. Her name was Victoria Lund, and she was the Chief Technology Officer of Meridian Energy Systems, which was one of the 4 or 5 largest independent natural gas processors in North America. Garrett knew who she was. He'd read her papers. He'd watched a talk she gave at an industry conference in 2020 on the streaming service his laptop used to be able to afford. She was in her mid-40s, wore a charcoal blazer and no jewelry except a watch, and moved through the expo floor with the particular energy of someone who had more meetings than hours in the day. She stopped at his booth. Garrett didn't know why she stopped. Maybe it was the prototype itself. Stripped down, unpolished, the kind of machine that looked like it had been built by someone who cared more about whether it worked than whether it photographed well. Maybe she'd glanced at the technical summary on his table. Maybe it was random. She picked up the binder. She flipped through the first few pages with the speed of someone skimming, and then she slowed down. She went back to page 7, which was the efficiency test data. She stood there reading for a long moment. Then she looked up and said, "You built this yourself?" "Yes," Garrett said. "In a shop, or my garage, and a borrowed equipment yard outside Midland for the pressure testing." Victoria Lund looked at the unit, then at the binder, then at Garrett. "You got your methodology written up? It's in section 3. She turned to section 3. "Read it." There was a small crease between her eyebrows that might have been skepticism or might have been concentration. With her, Garrett suspected the two were hard to tell apart. "These numbers," she said, and she turned the binder toward him, pointing at a column of efficiency figures. "You verified these independently." The test at the Midland yard was witnessed by the facility manager. His name and contact are in the appendix. She closed the binder, looked at him directly for the first time with her full attention, the way people do when they've decided something matters. How does it handle thermal expansion variance at peak load? It was exactly the right question. Garrett had been waiting for it, not from her specifically, but from someone, anyone, for 3 years, he told her. He didn't look at the laptop, he didn't refer to the binder. He'd been carrying this in his head for so long that the words came out evenly, the way the words for a prayer come out evenly when you've said it 10,000 times. He explained the valve geometry, the feedback timing, the compensation mechanism he'd designed after the 3rd prototype failed in a way that had taken him 6 weeks to diagnose. He explained it the way his father had taught him to explain mechanical things. From the ground up, no shortcuts, no assuming the other person already understands what you haven't said yet. Victoria Lund listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a pause. Not a polite pause, a genuine one. "I want our lead engineer to look at this," she said. "I need you to not sell this to anyone for the next 2 hours." "I'm not really in a position to sell anything to anyone," Garrett said. "No," she said, almost to herself. "I don't suppose you are." She set the binder back on the table. 2 hours. Don't go anywhere." She walked away at the same pace she'd arrived. Garrett sat down on the folding chair behind his table and stared at the unit. He thought about Becca. He thought about the card in his glove compartment. He thought about Donna, the way he always thought about Donna at moments that mattered. A quick, clean flash of her, more a feeling than an image, a sense of her presence that was gone in a second but left him steadier than he'd been before. He ate a granola bar he'd brought from home. He answered 2 more questions from passers-by, neither of which went anywhere. At 12:40, a man came by who introduced himself as the garage project man from earlier, apparently rerouted through Hall C on his way to a lunch meeting. He glanced at the table, and this time his half-smile carried a different edge. "Any takers?" he said. "A few conversations," Garrett said. "Good luck," the man said in the tone people use for good luck when they mean something else. Derek Salter arrived at 1:15. Garrett recognized him too, though he hadn't expected to see him here. Derek Salter was the founder and CEO of Caliber Energy Technologies, a Dallas-based firm that had gone public 2 years prior at a valuation that had made a significant number of people very wealthy very quickly. He was 55, tall, the kind of man who had spent enough time being the smartest person in the room that he no longer needed to perform confidence because it had become indistinguishable from how he breathed. He came with Victoria Lund and a younger man Garrett didn't recognize who carried a tablet and said nothing. Salter stood in front of the unit with his hands in his pockets. "This is the one," Victoria said. Salter looked at the unit. He looked at the printed technical summary without picking it up. He looked at Garrett in the specific way of a man conducting an appraisal. "Where'd you go to school?" he said. "Midland College, 2 years, mechanical technology." Salter nodded in a way that was not a compliment. "And you're telling me this does what?" He gestured at the unit. "What's the claim here?" Garrett explained it again. "Shorter version, same precision." Salter listened with his arms crossed, his expression neutral in the practiced way of someone who had learned not to let his face give him away in negotiations. When Garrett finished, Salter said 15% efficiency improvement under variable load, 14.8 in the Midland test, higher in 2 of the 5 runs, in a controlled environment, in an active equipment yard at operating pressure. The parameters are documented. Salter looked at Victoria. Something passed between them that Garrett couldn't read. Salter looked back at the unit. "And you hold the IP?" "I do. I filed provisional patents on the core mechanism in January." Salter uncrossed his arms. He put his hands back in his pockets. He looked, for just a moment, like a man recalibrating, like someone who had walked into a room expecting to find one thing and found another. "I want our engineering team to examine this before the show closes," he said. "I've been asked to hold it for another hour," Garrett said. "By someone else." Salter looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at the wall. "You're telling me there's already interest. I'm telling you what the situation is." Salter pulled a card from his inside jacket pocket and set it on the table. "I'll be back at 3, he said. "Don't make any decisions before then." He left. The next 90 minutes were the strangest of Garrett Finch's life, and his life had included some strange 90-minute stretches. Victoria Lund's engineer, a precise woman named Dr. Ashby, who wore safety glasses on top of her regular glasses and brought her own measurement tools, arrived at 1:30 and spent 45 minutes going through the unit with focused efficiency, asking specific questions that Garrett answered, taking notes. At 2:15 she called Victoria. At 2:30 a representative from Paragon Capital, a private equity firm Garrett had never heard of but whose business card identified them as specializing in energy infrastructure and emerging technology investment, appeared at the table. He'd been referred, he said, by the procurement coordinator from Corpus Christi. At 2:40, Derek Salter came back early. He walked in, saw the man from Paragon Capital standing at Garrett's table, and stopped. Then, in a move that Garrett would think about for a long time afterward, Salter sat down in the folding chair across from Garrett's table, the one meant for visitors, straightened his jacket, and said, "What's it going to take?" That was when things stopped being the kind of experience you describe afterward and became the kind you live through, mostly by not thinking too hard about what's happening. What happened was a licensing negotiation that took 3 weeks after the expo and involved 2 law firms and a video call with an engineering team in Calgary. But the shape of it was visible that afternoon, in the shift in how people stood around Garrett's table and how they spoke, and who called whom on their phones and stepped to the side of the aisle to talk quietly. Meridian Energy Systems was the first to submit a term sheet. Their offer was for an exclusive licensing arrangement, a base payment of $30 million, plus royalties structured around deployment scale, plus a consulting arrangement that would bring Garrett on as a technical advisor at a rate that made him look at the number twice. 3 days later, Caliber Energy Technologies countered with a different structure, a partial acquisition of the IP, not exclusive, but with a higher base figure, $42 million, with performance bonuses tied to efficiency outcomes in field deployment. Then Paragon Capital came in with a third option. They were proposing to fund the formation of a standalone company around the technology, with Garrett retaining a 30% equity stake, initial capitalization of $20 million, and a deployment contract from 2 operating partners they already had relationships with. Projected total value to Garrett under their model exceeded $60 million over 5 years. His lawyer, a woman named Carla Bridges he'd found through a referral from the Midland County Bar Association, and who had never handled a deal like this but was sharp and honest about what she didn't know and got up to speed fast, told him he needed to slow down and think. He took a weekend. He drove home to Odessa on a Friday evening. Becca was with his sister-in-law, had been all week, and he picked her up on the way. She fell asleep in the truck outside Pecos, and he drove the last hour and a half with her asleep in the passenger seat, her head tipped against the window. And he thought about the garage and the notebooks and the 3 years and the scar on his forearm and the way Donna had always said that the thing about him was he didn't know when to quit, and she meant it as a frustration, but it wasn't. It wasn't. He chose the Paragon structure. Carla negotiated revisions that strengthened his position on IP retention and added performance floor protections. The final total under the revised structure was contingent in part on deployment outcomes, but the base and near-term components came to just over $48 million. The standalone company would be headquartered in Odessa. Garrett would serve as chief technology officer. He would also need to hire people. He had no idea how to do that and made a note to figure it out. Victoria Lund called him 2 weeks after the deal closed on a Tuesday morning. He was in the garage, which was still half covered in the organized debris of 3 years of building, a state he hadn't gotten around to cleaning up because he wasn't sure he wanted to. She didn't congratulate him on the deal. She was not that kind of person. What she said was, "I want you to know that the reason I stopped at your table was the testing documentation. Most people bring a pitch deck. You brought methodology. That's unusual. It's what I had," Garrett said. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm saying." She paused. "My firm will be watching the field deployment results closely." "So will I," he said. After she hung up, he stood in the garage for a while. He thought about the afternoon in Dallas, the folding chair, the granola bar, the garage project comment. He thought about Derek Salters sitting down across from him. He thought about Becca's card with the rocket ship. He went inside, into the kitchen, and took the card out of the drawer where he'd moved it after the expo to keep it safe. He read it again. "Go, Dad," it said in 9-year-old handwriting, uneven and absolutely sure of itself. He put it back in the drawer. Then he made a pot of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the notebook where he'd started sketching the next thing.